Hello, everyone. Welcome to Politics of Latin America and the Caribbean. I am Dr. Nicole Warmington, and today we're going to start off with our first unit in the topic, trying to define what we mean by Latin America and looking at the legacy of colonialism. Now, when we talk about Latin America, what is it? One thing we should note is that Latin America is not a homogeneous region, despite the tendency to treat it as a single unit. The term itself was coined in Europe and groups together countries in the Western Hemisphere south of the United States that primarily speak the Romance languages, which includes Spanish, Portuguese, and French. The region actually includes 34 countries, spans nearly 8 million square miles, and is home to over 600 million people, making it extraordinarily diverse geographically, racially, culturally, and linguistically. So when you think about it, Latin America should be understood as a constructed category that masks a lot of internal differences, right? So that's what I want you guys to get. Now, when we speak about the land, the people, and the diversity, one thing should be noted is that the physical geography of Latin America is among the most diverse in the world, ranging from tropical rainforests to river basins to deserts to high plateaus to mountain ranges that raise as high as nearly 23,000 feet. Now, before the European arrival, land was largely organized for collective use, but colonialism introduced large-scale land ownership, shaping political power and inequality that actually persists today. The population itself actually reflects centuries of migration and forced movement, including indigenous peoples, Europeans, Africans, Asians, and Middle Eastern groups. Extensive intermixing produced categories such as mestizos, mulattoes, and zambos, and it has contributed both to cultural richness and rigid racial hierarchies, right? So when you think about it, diversity is central to Latin America's identity, but it was organized through colonial systems of hierarchy. The political life of Latin America has been marked by instability and authoritarianism, with frequent coups, revolutions, and military rule throughout much of the 20th century. Competing ideologies from liberalism, communism, corporatism, and religious doctrines have intensified political conflict rather than stabilizing governance. Economically, the region has cycled through numerous models, from mercantilism and state-led industrialization to liberalism and regional integration. Despite periods of growth, inequality and poverty remain persistent, and it has been worsened by rapid urbanization and external dependence. Now, when we think about it, the political and economic volatility has been deeply rooted in the colonial structures rather than just simply bad governance. That's what we should note when we look at Latin America, right? But what about the relationship between Latin America and the United States? Despite the geographic proximity, the US's understanding of Latin America remains limited and shaped by stereotypes. Yet the region is strategically important to the US as a major trading partner, a source of migration, and a focal point of the Cold War and the post-Cold War foreign policy. The US demand for illicit drugs has also deeply affected the region's political and social stability. So when you think about it, the US, Latin American, and including the Caribbean relations are actually shaped by both interdependence and asymmetrical power. Now, let's talk a little bit about Latin America, right? There's a lot of contrast, there's a lot of paradox within this region. It's both old and new, it's both independent and dependent, autonomous and subordinate. You know, it's prosperous and it's poor. It's really a dichotomy, right? And through this, we are really learning how can we fully study and interpret its history and society. There's a lot that we need to kind of look at, you know, moving away from any racist epithets, some, you know, psychological simplifications, you know, even cultural distortions in trying to understand what is this region known as Latin America and the Caribbean. And to start, we really need to have an honest discussion about the legacy of colonialism. Now, colonialism in Latin America, which is very different if you want to compare it with the English-speaking Caribbean, was a very violent and destructive process, not benign to discovery. You found that indigenous populations declined as much as 90% in the first 100 years of colonialism due to disease, warfare, and exploitation. I mean, Frantz Fanon argued that colonialization was fundamentally a brutal imposition of European systems on native societies. When you look at the pre-Columbian societies across Latin America, you found that the Inca was actually hierarchical and patriarchal. But what made it very different from what happened when colonial masters came in, it also actually featured communal traditions that continues to even influence Andean communities today. So when we look at it, colonialism actually reshaped every aspect of Latin American society, its demography, its culture, economy, and its politics. When looking at conquest across this region, you found that a small number of Europeans conquered vast empires due to military technology, disease immunity, tactical experience, and existing indigenous hierarchies. You found that early colonial society was actually very rigidly stratified, with the Spanish ancestry determining status. Power was also concentrated at the top. As you could see from this diagram, it shows how this was. So your social status was based on your ethnicity. As we said, the Spanish ancestry was at the top. It's also based on legal dimensions, how they define people, your economic status, and what was your class. And it was very rigid in how it was. If you're in this particular class, you could actually not move up or move down. That is how it was structured. Now, when it came to women, and what it was like in the early colony, you found that women, especially indigenous and African women, were frequently subjected to sexual exploitation, while slavery and coerced labor became fundamental to colonial economy. You found that over 12 million Africans were forcibly enslaved, primarily to support the plantation agriculture and mining. Right? So that's where the slaves fell in. But, a lot of people don't realize that when you look across Latin America and the Caribbean, there were a lot of indentured servitudes in the British and French colonies. You had the Irish coming over that were supposed to work 5 to 7 year contracts. And at the end of the contract, they would have been granted land. And as we noted, some of these indentured servants didn't last, or 60% didn't last until the end of their contract. So that is what helped to shape how the colonial economy was run. So what we get from this particular section is that race, class, and gender hierarchies established during colonialism actually still structure inequality today. When looking at the economy, right, you found that colonial economies were designed for extraction, sending gold, silver, and agricultural products to Europe while importing expensive manufactured goods. This entrenched dependency, and it actually encouraged smuggling and the development of informal economies across the region. The Catholic Church, which was a large landowner, functioned both as a religious and a political institution, controlling land, education, welfare, and social norms. When you look at the colonial state, on the other hand, you found that it was actually highly centralized, particularly in Latin America and the Latin Caribbean. So if you're talking about Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, they were very highly centralized, very authoritarian, very militarized, and there was no meaningful political participation for most of the population in these areas. So you found that colonial governance helped to normalize authoritarianism and exclusion. As we move on to discuss independence and nationalism, we found that because colonial systems allowed very little participation, independence in Latin America was actually achieved largely through revolution rather than reform that we had seen happen across the English-speaking Caribbean, right, or the English part of this Western Hemisphere. They fought. Latin America and the Latin Caribbean tended to fight for their independence. However, we did find that independence often transferred power from European rulers to local elites, leaving many of the colonial structures intact. So you found, when you look at the early years of Latin America and even the legacy that we see today, that political independence did not necessarily mean social or economic liberalization. So what I want to take away from our understanding of the legacy of colonialism is that Latin America's contemporary political instability, inequality, and dependence cannot be understood without recognizing colonialism as a deeply violent, hierarchical system whose structures continue to shape the region today. Thank you.